the Boeing B-29 Superfortress. Even if you know nothing about aviation history, you've probably heard the name. It's the aircraft that dropped the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the plane that ended World War II in the Pacific. It's remembered as America's ultimate strategic bomber, a technological marvel that dominated the skies over Japan. But here's what most people don't know. The B-29 very nearly didn't make it into combat at all. It killed more American aircrew during training than it did enemy combatants in its first year of operations. Depending on how you count it, the B-29 program rivaled or exceeded the Manhattan Project in cost, and when it finally did reach the Pacific theater, it performed so poorly in its intended role that the entire strategic bombing campaign had to be completely reimagined from scratch. The B-29 wasn't just an aircraft development program, it was the largest and most expensive military project of World War II, a $3 billion gamble that nearly bankrupted Boeing, drove its engineers to nervous breakdowns, and came within a hair's breadth of being cancelled multiple times. The fact that it eventually succeeded is less a story of American engineering prowess and more a tale of desperation, improvisation, and sheer bloody-minded determination. What follows are 7 aspects of the B-29 story that rarely make it into the highlight reels. Not the sanitized version about American technological superiority, but the messy, complicated, often darkly absurd reality of what it took to build the most advanced bomber of World War II. Let's start with the money, because the numbers are genuinely staggering. The Manhattan Project, which developed the atomic bombs that the B-29 would eventually carry, cost approximately $2 billion in 1940s dollars. Depending on how you count it, whether you include production costs, infrastructure development, and training programs, the B-29 program rivaled or exceeded that figure at roughly $3 billion. To put that in perspective, that's roughly $50 billion in today's money, spent on a single aircraft type during a war that was consuming American resources at a rate never seen before or since. This wasn't just expensive by wartime standards, it was expensive by any standards. The B-29 represented the single largest military expenditure of World War II, surpassing even the development of radar, the proximity fuse, and yes, nuclear weapons. Boeing was essentially betting the entire company on an aircraft that didn't yet exist, using technologies that hadn't yet been proven, for a mission profile that hadn't yet been attempted. The reason for this extraordinary cost was simple. Nothing like the B-29 had ever been built before. It wasn't an incremental improvement over existing designs. It was a clean-sheet aircraft that required fundamental breakthroughs in pressurization, engine technology, fire control systems, and aerodynamics. Every one of these systems had to be developed simultaneously, at enormous expense, with no guarantee any of them would actually work. Boeing's chief engineer, Wilwood Beale, later admitted that if the company had known how difficult the project would be, they never would have taken it on. The development program drove multiple engineers to complete mental breakdowns. One Boeing executive reportedly told his staff, "We're going to build this airplane even if it bankrupts the company," which was not exactly an idle threat given that Boeing's entire financial future was riding on a bomber that kept killing its own test pilots. And here's the truly absurd part. Even after spending $3 billion, the aircraft that emerged was so plagued with problems that it couldn't actually perform its intended mission. Which brings us to our second point. The B-29 had a well-deserved reputation among its crews as the most dangerous aircraft in the American inventory, and they weren't talking about enemy action. In its first year of operations, from mid-1944 through mid-1945, more American aircrew died in B-29 training and ferry accidents than were lost to enemy action over Japan. Engine fires were so common that crews simply expected them. The standard procedure wasn't if an engine catches fire, but when an engine catches fire and the standard response was to shut it down, feather the prop, and pray the fire didn't spread before you could get the aircraft on the ground. The problem was the Wright R3350 duplex Cyclone engine, a magnificent piece of engineering that was also one of the most temperamental power plants ever fitted to a production aircraft. On paper, it was perfect for the B-29, 2,200 horsepower from 18 cylinders arranged in 2 rows, giving the Superfortress the power it needed to haul 10,000 pounds of bombs across 3,000 miles of ocean. In practice, the R3350 overheated constantly, caught fire regularly, and had a nasty habit of swallowing its own valves, which would cause catastrophic engine failure without warning. The magnesium crankcase was particularly problematic because when it did catch fire, it burned with an intensity that made extinguishing it nearly impossible. Magnesium fires burn at over 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit and cannot be put out with water or conventional fire suppressants, which the crews learned the hard way. The aircraft's fuel system made these fires even more deadly. Early B-29s had fuel tanks in the wings directly adjacent to the engines, which meant that when an engine fire occurred, you had perhaps 30 seconds before the flames reached the fuel and turned the entire aircraft into a flying bomb. Pilots were instructed to immediately order the crew to bail out if an engine fire couldn't be controlled within the first minute, which tells you everything you need to know about the aircraft's survivability. On the 18th of February 1943, the second XB-29 prototype crashed during a test flight when an engine fire spread to the wing fuel tanks. The aircraft fell on a meatpacking plant in Seattle, killing all 11 crew members aboard plus 20 people on the ground. Boeing's chief test pilot, Edmund T. Allen, was at the controls. His last radio transmission was, "We're coming in with a wing on fire." They didn't make it. This was not an isolated incident. Throughout 1943 and early 1944, B-29s were crashing at a rate of approximately one per week during training flights, almost always due to engine fires or failures. Crews began referring to the aircraft as the Widowmaker and the Flying Coffin, which was not exactly ideal for morale given that they were expected to fly these things across 1,500 miles of open ocean to bomb Japan. The Army Air Forces tried everything to fix the engine problems. They modified the cooling system, changed the fuel mixture, adjusted the magnetos, redesigned the oil system, and eventually just accepted that the R3350 was going to catch fire occasionally and focused on making sure crews could survive when it did. They moved fuel tanks away from the engines, improved the fire suppression systems, and drilled crews endlessly on emergency procedures. It helped, but not enough. Even in 1945, after 2 years of modifications and improvements, B-29 crews still faced a higher statistical chance of dying in a training accident than they did from enemy action over Japan. The B-29 was designed for high-altitude precision daylight bombing. That was the entire point of the aircraft. The pressurized cabin allowed crews to operate comfortably at 30,000 feet. The Norden bomb site promised accuracy measured in feet, not miles. The heavy defensive armament would protect the bombers from Japanese fighters. This was the doctrine that justified the $3 billion price tag. There was only one problem. None of it worked. When B-29s began combat operations against Japan in June 1944, the results were disastrous. Bombing from 30,000 feet over Japan, the aircraft encountered jet stream winds of 200 miles per hour or more that made accurate bombing impossible. Bombardiers reported that by the time their bombs reached the target, they had been blown miles off course. The Norden bomb site, which worked beautifully in the calm air over Europe, was useless in the turbulent conditions over the Japanese home islands. The high altitude also meant the aircraft encountered temperatures of minus 60 degrees Fahrenheit, which caused gun oil to freeze, oxygen systems to malfunction, and equipment to fail. The defensive guns, operated remotely through a complex fire control system, jammed constantly. The pressurization system, which had been the most technically challenging aspect of the entire aircraft's development, turned out to be largely pointless because crews still had to wear oxygen masks and heated suits to survive. And the bombing accuracy was, to put it mildly, terrible. Early missions were lucky to put 5% of their bombs within 1,000 feet of the target. Most bombs fell in open fields or residential areas, miles from the intended industrial targets. After 6 months of operations, the B-29 force had dropped thousands of tons of bombs on Japan and accomplished essentially nothing of strategic value. General Curtis LeMay, who took command of the bombing campaign in January 1945, looked at the results and made a decision that was either brilliant or insane depending on your perspective. He ordered the B-29s to stop bombing from high altitude entirely. Instead, they would go in low at 5,000 to 7,000 feet at night, carrying incendiary bombs instead of high explosives, with most of their defensive guns and gunners removed to save weight and allow them to carry more bombs. This was, on paper, suicidal. The entire point of the B-29's pressurized cabin and high-altitude performance was to keep it above the range of anti-aircraft fire and fighter interception. LeMay was proposing to throw away these advantages and send his bombers into the teeth of Japanese defenses at altitudes where every anti-aircraft gun in the country could reach them. But LeMay had realized something that the strategic bombing theorists back in Washington had missed. Japanese cities were made of wood and paper. You didn't need precision bombing to destroy them. You needed fire, and at low altitude, in the stable air close to the ground, bombardiers could actually hit what they were aiming at. The first low-level incendiary raid was flown on the night of March 9th to 10th, 1945, against Tokyo. 334 B-29s attacked the city with a mix of high explosive and incendiary bombs, creating a firestorm that killed an estimated 100,000 people in a single night. It was the deadliest bombing raid of World War II, more destructive than either atomic bomb, and it proved that LeMay's gamble had worked. Over the next 5 months, B-29 systematically burned down every major Japanese city, flying at altitudes the aircraft was never designed for, carrying bombs it wasn't meant to carry, executing a mission profile that bore no resemblance whatsoever to the specifications that had justified its development. The B-29 eventually won the strategic bombing campaign against Japan, but only because the Air Force completely abandoned the doctrine and tactics it was designed for. The pressurized cabin was the B-29's signature feature, the technological achievement that set it apart from every other bomber of World War II. It was also the source of endless problems and in World War II service proved far less useful than intended. Creating a pressurized cabin in a combat aircraft was an engineering challenge that made everything else about the B-29 look simple. The aircraft had to maintain an internal pressure equivalent to 8,000 feet altitude while flying at 30,000 feet, which meant the fuselage had to withstand a pressure differential of 6 pounds per square inch across every square foot of surface area. For a fuselage the size of the B-29's, that added up to several tons of force trying to tear the airplane apart at the seams, Boeing solved this with a completely redesigned fuselage structure featuring a figure-8 cross-section that distributed stress more evenly, heavy circumferential frames that prevented the fuselage from expanding like a balloon, and a complex system of pressure seals around every door, hatch, and equipment panel. The gun turrets, which had to allow free movement while maintaining pressure integrity, required entirely new designs. The bomb bay doors had to seal tightly enough to maintain cabin pressure, which added enormous complexity to what should have been a simple mechanism. All of this added thousands of pounds of weight and cost millions of dollars to develop. The return on this investment was supposed to be crews who could operate at high altitude without oxygen masks, heavy clothing, or heated suits, allowing them to function more effectively and suffer fewer casualties from cold and hypoxia. In practice, crews still had to wear oxygen masks because the cabin pressure, equivalent of 8,000 feet, wasn't actually enough to sustain normal operations. They still had to wear heated suits because the cabin heating system couldn't keep up with the minus 60-degree temperatures outside. And after LeMay's shift to low-altitude tactics, none of it mattered anyway because the aircraft was flying at altitudes where pressurization wasn't needed. The pressurization system's main contribution to the war effort turned out to be making the aircraft heavier, more complex, more expensive, and more prone to catastrophic failure. Pressure seal failures were common and could cause rapid decompression that left crews gasping for breath at 30,000 feet. The complex ducting system that distributed pressurized air throughout the fuselage was prone to leaks and failures, and the entire system required constant maintenance to keep functioning, which was difficult to provide in the primitive conditions of Pacific Island air bases. But it did create one unexpected benefit. The pressurized cabin made the B-29 significantly quieter inside than unpressurized bombers, which reduced crew fatigue on long missions. So that's something. A multi-million-dollar noise reduction system whose main contribution was making the cabin quieter. The B-29's defensive armament was controlled by a central fire control system that was genuinely revolutionary. Instead of individual gunners manning individual gun positions, the B-29 had 4 remote-controlled turrets operated by gunners sitting inside the pressurized cabin, looking through computerized sights that automatically calculated lead angles, altitude corrections, and ballistic drop. This system was supposed to provide overlapping fields of fire that would make the B-29 nearly invulnerable to fighter attack. The top forward turret could be controlled by the bombardier or the flight engineer. The top rear turret and both lower turrets could be operated by any of the 3 gunners, with a computer automatically assigning turrets based on where the threat was coming from. The tail gunner had his own isolated position, with twin .50 caliber machine guns and a 20mm cannon. In theory, this meant that a single attacking fighter could face fire from multiple turrets simultaneously, all automatically aimed and corrected for range, speed, and deflection. The system was so sophisticated that it included analog computers that factored in the bomber's airspeed, altitude, and attitude to calculate the precise lead angle needed to hit a maneuvering target, in theory. In practice, the system was a maintenance nightmare that rarely worked as designed. The analog computers were temperamental and prone to failure. The electric motors that drove the turrets overheated and burned out regularly. The ammunition feed systems jammed constantly, especially at high altitude where the extreme cold caused lubricants to congeal. The sighting system fogged up in the humid conditions over the Pacific. And the whole system was so complex that most ground crews couldn't repair it properly, leading to aircraft going into combat with partially functional defensive armament. Japanese fighter pilots quickly learned that the B-29's defensive fire was far less effective than American publicity claimed. They developed tactics specifically designed to exploit the system's weaknesses, attacking from angles where the turrets couldn't traverse quickly enough to track them, or making high-speed head-on passes that gave the fire control computers less time to calculate solutions. The 20mm cannon in the tail position was particularly problematic. It was supposed to provide devastating firepower against attackers approaching from the rear, but it jammed so frequently that most tail gunners simply ignored it and relied on the twin .50 caliber machine guns instead. The cannon was eventually removed from most aircraft to save weight, which tells you everything you need to know about its battlefield effectiveness. After LeMay stripped most of the guns and gunners out of his B-29s to allow them to carry more incendiaries, the sophisticated fire control system became largely irrelevant anyway. Most low-level night missions were flown with only the tail gunner aboard, rendering the entire multi-million-dollar central fire control system completely pointless. Over the course of World War II, the B-29 force lost 414 aircraft to enemy action over Japan. It lost 147 aircraft to operational accidents, and another 82 to crashes during training. That's a total of 229 aircraft lost to non-combat causes, representing more than a third of all B-29 losses during the war. And these figures don't include aircraft written off, due to damage or mechanical failure that never made it into the official loss statistics. These weren't just training accidents or isolated incidents. B-29s crashed at a remarkably consistent rate throughout the entire war, killing crews on routine ferry flights, training missions, and even at secure bases far from any combat zone. The most common cause was engine failure, usually accompanied by fire. Despite 2 years of improvements and modifications, the R3350 engines continued to fail at alarming rates right up until the end of the war. Crews learned to expect at least one engine failure on any long-distance mission, and most B-29s returned from combat with one or more engines shut down. The second most common cause was simply running out of fuel. The B-29's fuel consumption was enormous, and calculating endurance for a mission across 1,500 miles of ocean required precise navigation and careful fuel management. Get the calculations wrong, or encounter headwinds that were stronger than expected, and you were going to end up in the ocean well short of base. Ditching a B-29 in the ocean was survivable, but only barely. The aircraft was heavy and landed hard, and the impact usually broke the fuselage into pieces. Crews that survived the ditching often drowned or died of exposure before rescue arrived. The Pacific was a very large ocean, and finding a few men in a life raft from the air was extraordinarily difficult. Perhaps the most infamous operational loss occurred on the 1st of June 1945, when a B-29 carrying Brigadier General Nathan Twining crashed in the ocean during a routine administrative flight. Twining survived, spending 6 days in a life raft before being rescued, but 6 of the 14 people aboard died in the crash or from exposure. This was the commanding general of the 20th Air Force, flying in a well-maintained aircraft flown by an experienced crew on a clear day, nowhere near enemy action. The B-29 killed him anyway, or very nearly did. The operational accident rate remained stubbornly high throughout the war despite continuous efforts to improve training, maintenance, and procedures. Even after the war ended, B-29s continued to crash at rates that would be considered completely unacceptable today. The aircraft was simply too complex, too temperamental, and too dependent on functioning systems to be reliable in the harsh conditions of Pacific operations. By the summer of 1944, the B-29 program was on the verge of complete failure, The aircraft was still suffering engine failures at alarming rates. Bombing accuracy was terrible. Crews were being killed in training faster than they could be replaced, and perhaps most critically, there was nowhere to base the aircraft that could actually reach Japan. The original plan had been to base B-29s in China, flying fuel and bombs over the hump from India to supply them. This turned out to be logistically impossible. It took 7 flights over the Himalayas to deliver enough fuel for one B-29 mission to Japan. The Chinese bases were under constant threat from Japanese ground forces, and the distances involved meant that B-29s could barely reach the southern Japanese islands, let alone Tokyo. The Navy's island-hopping campaign across the Pacific wasn't moving fast enough to provide suitable airfields within range of Japan. Saipan, which would eventually become the primary B-29 base, wasn't captured until July 1944, and the airfields there weren't ready for operations until October. Meanwhile, back in Washington, there were serious discussions about cancelling the entire B-29 program and redirecting resources to aircraft that actually worked. The Navy was arguing that carrier-based aircraft could accomplish the same mission at a fraction of the cost. Army Air Forces officers who weren't personally invested in the B-29's success were suggesting that the money would be better spent on more B-17s and B-24s for the European theatre. General Henry Hap Arnold, commanding general of the Army Air Forces, staked his entire reputation on making the B-29 work. He personally intervened multiple times to keep the program funded and to override recommendations to cancel or scale it back. He removed commanders who weren't delivering results fast enough and installed LeMay specifically because he believed LeMay would find a way to make the B-29 effective regardless of the challenges. Arnold's determination verged on obsession. He suffered multiple heart attacks during the war, at least one of which his doctors attributed to the stress of the B-29 program. He was consumed by the knowledge that if the B-29 failed, his legacy would be as the general who wasted $3 billion on a bomber that couldn't fight. The program's survival came down to a series of near-run decisions that could have gone either way. If Saipan hadn't been captured when it was, the China bases couldn't have sustained operations long enough to prove the concept. If LeMay hadn't switched to low-altitude incendiary tactics when he did, the high-altitude precision bombing campaign would have continued to produce negligible results, until someone in Washington finally pulled the plug. If the engine problems hadn't improved enough to reduce the accident rate, crew morale might have collapsed entirely. Any one of these failures could have ended the program. The fact that the B-29 survived was less a vindication of its design, and more a testament to institutional momentum, political pressure, and the absence of viable alternatives for striking the Japanese home islands. Today, approximately 30 B-29s survive in museums around the world. Only 2 are airworthy: Fifi, operated by the Commemorative Air Force, and Doc, restored by a group of volunteers in Wichita, Kansas, and returned to flight in 2016. Both aircraft draw enormous crowds at air shows, where people marvel at their size, their complexity, and their historical significance. What these museum plaques rarely mention is how close the B-29 came to failure, how many American lives it cost, and how little resemblance the aircraft's actual combat use bore to the mission it was designed for. The B-29 succeeded in spite of its design, not because of it, through a combination of desperation, improvisation, and the willingness to completely abandon the doctrines that justified its creation. The aircraft's true legacy isn't technological. The pressurized cabin, the central fire control system, the advanced aerodynamics, none of these innovations proved decisive or were adopted widely in subsequent designs. What the B-29 actually proved was that even a fundamentally flawed weapon system could be made to work through sheer institutional determination, unlimited resources, and a willingness to sustain losses that would be unthinkable today. It also proved something darker, that the most destructive weapon of World War II wasn't the atomic bomb, but rather conventional incendiaries delivered by the tens of thousands against cities designed to burn. The B-29s that attacked Japan in 1945 killed more people, destroyed more property, and caused more suffering than any weapon system before or since. And they did it using tactics that were invented by necessity rather than design. The aircraft sitting in museums today are impressive machines, and the men who flew them were undeniably brave. But the real story of the B-29 isn't about bravery or technological achievement. It's about what happens when a military bureaucracy commits to a weapon system before it's ready. throws billions of dollars and thousands of lives at making it work, and succeeds through improvisation rather than planning. The B-29 didn't win the war through American engineering superiority. It won because Curtis LeMay realized the billion-dollar bomber worked better as a low-altitude truck for hauling incendiaries than it did as the high-altitude precision instrument it was designed to be. That's not the story that makes it into the commemorative plaques, but it's the true one.